Thank you, Alison, and thank you, everybody working behind the scenes to make this happen at AUB in New York and Beirut. And thank you especially to Ali for being with us today. When I saw the event at the Capitol a few weeks ago, my first instinct was to try to see what Ali Soufan is going to be saying about this, because I've known him for a couple of years now, and he's been about 25 years, he's been tracking and studying and analyzing and interviewing people involved in violent extremism with the FBI initially, and then later with his consulting and advisory services and his nonprofit research center. And I thought it was a really timely moment to look at what is now a really dangerous and out in the open phenomenon in the United States and parts of Europe and other places in the West, which is the right-wing violent, radical extremists, nationalists, racists, whatever you want to call them, and to also tap into Ali's many years of experience with similar radical, violent extremists and terrorists in the Middle East and Asia and other parts of the world. So Ali, thank you so much for being with us. We're really honored and pleased. So let me ask you the first question, the broad question. From your work, do you see similarities and or differences among the groups doing this kind of violent work in the West, as well as people who do it in the Middle East and Asia? And then after that, we'll get into a little bit more details about this.
Great, thank you, Rami. Always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. Thank you, Alison, for the nice introduction. Absolutely. I mean, there are significant similarities between, for example, what we've seen with the so-called global jihadis movement and what we've seen today, or what we are seeing today with the white supremacist ideology. We've been monitoring this for a while, for more than 2 years so far, just the nature of that similarity and the transnational dimension of the so-called white supremacy movement in the United States and also in other countries. So I think about 2 years ago, I even testified in Congress at the Homeland Security Committee about this threat, about the transnational nature of the threat and the similarities between the two threats at the Homeland Security Committee in the House. And it was, I think, the longest hearing the committee had since its founding after 9/11. So, like the jihadis, white supremacist extremists justify the use of extreme violence. They wanted to create a worldview of them and us. Both in all their propaganda and all their narratives and their social media, they repeat this whole, the us versus them mentality. Both groups often deploy metaphors in their writings and in their propaganda to reflect a firm belief that their societies are under siege, that only violence can halt the so-called invaders. With the jihadis, it's the US, it's the Israelis, it is the West. With the white supremacists, it's immigrants, and it's people who are coming to invade and change the nature of Europe and the US. Both they claim that their way of life is under imminent threat of extinction. One group believes in racial purity, the other believes in religious purity. Violence is always viewed by both groups as something that is both utilitarian, but at times theatrical, a propaganda message to inspire, a propaganda message to recruit, and also to terrorize and create socio-political change. All the ingredients of most definitions of terrorism. Last of all, among far-right extremists in the United States today, there are countless radicals who play a similar role to jihadi propagandists, preaching violence, preaching hate to their followers, behind the shield of constitutional protections, behind the shield of the First Amendments, charismatic personalities, religious social narratives, and a persistent message of a community under siege is so essential in their battle. And we see that also, as you know, with the so-called jihadi groups and other terrorist groups in Asia and in the Middle East. But unlike the jihadis, the United States is basically the Mecca for the lack of a better term, of the white supremacist ideologues. The United States today play basically the role that countries like Saudi Arabia played in the 80s and 90s for the jihadis. Most of the ideologues, most of these groups are connected directly to the United States and to groups and individuals and personalities that's taken advantage of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment in the United States to promote their hate. But before that, also, I just wanted to mention one thing about both the groups and how they use communication tools, especially the social media platforms, to promote their narratives and to recruit vulnerable population on online space. And that has been a really useful tool for both that we've seen them using, in such a profound way.
Thank you, Ali. You've talked about so many different dimensions of these issues. I've been studying the political movements and extremism in the Middle East for about 35 years now. And I've even watched individuals in some countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt. You can track individuals who would be Arab nationalist extremists, and then they'd become Ba'athist extremists, and then they'd become Islamists, they join the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they might eventually join Al-Qaeda or ISIS. So this is a story ultimately about individual men and women, most of whom come from middle-class lives, some of whom are engineers and doctors and lawyers, and others are impoverished. So the question I want to ask you is, from your studies and your work in the Western world and the Middle East, do you see a single pattern of how an average, nonviolent, maybe even non-politicized man or woman, young man or woman usually, how they end up becoming supporters of or even members of some of these groups? And in the Middle East, when ISIS emerged in 2014, there were polls a year or two later, credible polls that showed that in some cases you had 8–10% of populations saying that what ISIS was doing was legitimate. They wouldn't necessarily join them, but they saw them as legitimate. So what explains the transformation of ordinary people into supporters of these kind of movements?
I think, Rami, this is a great question, and I find myself learning a lot from your writings on this topic throughout the years. But I talk just from my own personal experience, and I don't think there is one single issue. There is no cookie cutter approach here, but I think I can talk about the radicalization cycle. And I think there is, 5 different steps that will eventually lead to terrorism. So first of all, you have personal, political, or cultural grievances, and these grievances varies. In the Arab world, for example, in the Muslim world, we had grievances at one point regarding the Arab-Israeli conflicts, and then grievances regarding democracy and freedoms and dictatorships and liberty and economic grievances, cultural grievances, and so forth. And then you have individuals coming and saying, look, I have a solution for you. It's religion. The reason the Israelis are, won in 19, in the war is because they are true to their religion. You're not. And you start seeing this political movement, coming together in Egypt, and then you start seeing other things in Afghanistan and so forth, and geopolitical struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia that kind of like promoted these religious groups and eventually led to people like Osama bin Laden to take advantage of all the things that's going on. So there's always personal grievances, and that differs from society to society, from culture to culture. In the United States, we start to see these grievances. You can see the big lie about the election being stolen. You can see the issue of for example, QAnons with the deep state and Jewish cabal and controlling the world, and a lot of these kind of issues that affects people differently, and they start to believe in it. Then now you start to go online and you see sympathizers and you see extremist groups who believe in these kind of issues, and you find your own echo chamber. Start seeing people and communicating to people who legitimizes your grievances and give you a very simple solution for complicated personal or political problem. Then you will see these groups that try to enable you to do something with this. So you become part of these entities, and now you're not only listener, passive listener, you get involved in even broadcasting your intent of change, of doing something to kind of create a society or create an environment that your grievances doesn't exist in it. And eventually, some of these individuals will have, will go further to an event, and that can be the insurrection that we saw January 6th. That can be, the event that we saw, for example, in Charlottesville. That can be a demonstration, for example, let's say in an Arab capital where people, get killed and created rage in the society. And eventually, from all these 5 things, you will have individuals, after this cycle, you will have individuals who basically decide, like, look, you know what, the only way we can move, the only way we can move the pendulum, the only way that we can have effective change in our society is through violence and is through terrorism. And we start seeing that today, Rami, with the white supremacists movement. So we monitor their communication online, and we see them, basically saying, look, in order to really make some change here, you have to believe in accelerationism, very similar to the concept of jihad. Basically violence to impact and accelerate a change in the society. We start seeing all these white supremacist groups saying, look, this is our opportunity to reach out to what they call the megatards and tell them, look, the only way you can make change is to actually join us. Don't believe QAnon, don't believe these false prophecies, this date that the deep state is gonna, basically crumble. You can actually do change. And they are talking to each other and saying, look, this is the best opportunity for us after the insurrection, because now we can actually talk to a lot of megatards and we can tell them that we are the solution for all their problems. We can tell them, look, you are in a situation today that you have a government that is not legitimate. The election was stolen. You know it. We know it. Trump told you it was stolen. And now you have a situation where you have taxation without representation. And that is something very, kind of like they connect deeply to American psyche. It's very similar to the concept of jihad that bin Laden is promoting. It goes, the foundation of America is based on a rebellion against taxation without representation. And from their communications with these white supremacist groups, they say, look, this is a great opportunity. We don't have to talk about what happened with the Holocaust. We don't have to, justify World War II and Hitler and everything. We can just focus our message as such. And this is just to see how the radicalization cycle, these 5 things can develop terrorism, and they are very similar. You can put an ISIS person in the middle of this cycle. You can put a Al-Qaeda person in the middle of this cycle. You can put a white supremacist, neo-Nazi person in the UK or in England or in the United States, or any individual of those who participated in the insurrection on January 6th. And that fits. So this cycle, I believe, is the cycle that need to be disrupted and need to be tackled at every level. Otherwise, I think what we've seen in the Middle East, there is a big possibility we start seeing down the road, years from now, in Western societies.
So that raises really fascinating issues about the motives within an individual person and linked to the political changes in society. Whether those political changes are accurately uh, expressed or it's fake news or whatever, but it's really the linkage between what's inside a person and what's going on in their world that leads them to do this. One of the fascinating things in the Middle East, especially with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, is when people joined these groups, they could take on a new name, that they didn't just join this world that you described where they were suddenly they had power, they were not powerless, they were not mistreated, they were changing the world. And in a way that they legitimized with religion and other things, but they also took on a new name. They were kind of reborn. Do you see any of this in the white supremacist and the nationalist movements in the Western world, where people deal with some of their personal stresses and issues and create a new life that gets them away from their old problems?
Well, I think the reason people take a new name in the Middle East is because of a hadith, the Black Banner hadith, where the Prophet said basically at the end of time, the Black Banner army come from Khorasan. And he gives detailed descriptions of that army, saying not only their banners are black, but also their names are aliases, and their aliases are after cities. And that's why you will see all these individuals using aliases, and then they'll have a kunya based on a city, Al-Jaddawi, Al-Shami, whatever. And you could go down the San'ani, and you go down the list. So there's a religious justification for that in order to make yourself feel, because the group is telling you that you are in a movement way bigger than you, way bigger than anyone who's involved in this movement. It is a movement that the Prophet, peace be upon him, predicted. And you are essential part of it. And you have that name exactly like the Prophet told you your name is going to be. So in the white supremacist movement, we see something similar, but we don't see them taking names. We don't see them reborn. We just see them basically operating in a framework that they don't acknowledge the existence of the society as we know it. And if it exists, either they convince themselves that this is all false, or they wanted to change it. They wanted to basically create conditions that will have that society collapse from inside. And that's what we're seeing. We see them, that's why they go and they do these, these training camps. They take advantage of Second Amendment to create so-called militias and so forth, taking advantage of the system that exists in order to destroy the system that exists. And that's what we're seeing. And I think a lot of people make this big mistake that anyone who is, involved in the Make America Great Again movement, MAGA, or anyone who voted for Trump, or anyone who's involved, believe that the conspiratorial narratives of Q is part of that movement. And it's not true. Like in the Middle East, for example, and Rami, you're an authority on this and you wrote about it, there's a lot of political and cultural movement that took place. You mentioned Arab nationalism, Baathism, the Arab-Israeli conflict has significant impact on the way people in the Middle East saw things, but not all these things contributed directly and caused Osama bin Laden to happen. Yes, elements of it, were utilized down the road to force somebody like Osama bin Laden to come and start recruiting individuals who have the tendency to basically rebel on the society because the society hasn't been fair to them, or the society hasn't been fair to what they believe it ought to be fair, to. And I think we see that very similar narrative in the West with the white supremacist groups and with the neo-Nazi groups and the ultra-right groups. And they are trying currently to take advantage of the anger and the grievances of people in the MAGA movement, or people who believe that Trump won the election, and telling them, you know what, this democratic tyranny needs to end, and the only way to end it is to accelerate its demise, and that's why you have to move to join us. And unfortunately, they are finding listening ears and open hearts, but also at the same time, as we've seen in the Middle East, there is, or actually more than one, there are few countries in the world that's taken advantage of this and trying to promote these groups in order to create further division in the West. Russia, China, and even countries like Iran, we start seeing activities online to make these individuals feel more emboldened and more mainstream. And I think as we've seen with these groups being utilized by foreign governments in the West, in the Middle East, we're seeing these Western white supremacist organizations being manipulated also by foreign governments.
Mm-hmm. So if you take the Middle East and Asia first, and then we'll come back to the US, one of the things that we noticed there is that Al-Qaeda and then ISIS and then many other smaller jihadi groups, they were born in situations of national collapse and catastrophe. Al-Qaeda came out of Afghanistan. It was mostly Saudis and Egyptians, but it came out of Afghanistan where they could work and create themselves and get recruits and fight off the Russians. And protect the Islamic land that was occupied by foreign armies. And then ISIS was in Syria and Iraq, two devastated lands, partly because of the US-led invasion, partly because other Arab countries were there, but many different reasons. But you had chaos allowed these groups to take root and emerge. And these were small groups in the beginning, as of course you followed them. You were talking about hundreds of actual core people. What is the role, therefore, in your view, of the political management of these countries? If you had countries that were well managed, that were not allowed to fall into chaos, where you did not have foreign armies coming in, would this be a main priority to fighting future radicalization in the region? And is there any parallel to that in the US?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the cycle that we talked to is about grievances. And most of the grievances that you mentioned with Al-Qaeda or ISIS is grievances that results of weak states or states that's considered an agent for foreign governments. And that was the main anger. So if you have a social problem, a social grievance, political grievance, economic grievance, it's always rooted into that. And you see that very clearly in the August 23rd, 1996 declaration of jihad of Osama bin Laden. And later on with ISIS, the situation is a little bit different, but also similar. You mentioned the invasion of Iraq, you mentioned the situation in Syria, the Syrian rebellion. A lot of people were angry because, they felt that people are not doing enough to get rid of the dictatorship of the Assad regime. So there's many different components to it that allowed ISIS to exist. But we have to keep in mind that all these incidents that took place basically make of ISIS an accident of history rather than something more deep than that. It's like the stars lined up for them to be what they were. And I think when you look though into the cycle that we talked about, a fair, strong state that doesn't allow foreign intervention and create justice for their people, to the most part, eliminate the foundation of this cycle with the grievances. And unfortunately in the United States now, we have a lot of individuals, they feel that the system is not good for them, is not treating them fairly. We can talk for hours about this. There are regions in the United States that's really devastated economically because of NAFTA or because of the change of the nature of the world economy, or there are people who believe that Mexicans and others are taking their job. There are people who believe, like they are in Europe, that the Western civilization is changing and there is an invasion by brown people and black people, and they hate that. And unfortunately, more and more, we have people from the mainstream, even the former president of the United States, casting doubt on the trust in the institutions. And I think when you start doing that, that social contract that you have start to weaken. And when that start to weaken, there is a possibility down the road that you will have situations similar to what we have in different places, you know, in the Middle East, what you had in Lebanon specifically. I mean, the social contract is the cornerstone of the government, of the society. But when your social contract becomes many social contracts, in Lebanon, we have every sect has its own social contract with its leaders. And you have to basically wait until all of them you know, agree with each other to what's going to happen to the whole country, that lack one significant social contract. Nobody more than us talk about nationalism, but our nationalism in Lebanon is basically sectarianism. If it fits my sect, then it's good for the nation. If it doesn't fit my sect, then it's not good for the nation. And unfortunately, we start seeing the same thing now among people here in the United States. We've seen it with the, you know, with the election lie that, you know, I don't believe this guy is my president. I don't believe, you know, I voted and the result wasn't what I wanted it to be. So thus, I don't acknowledge the results of that election. And you know, add to it the conspiracies about deep state, add to it the conspiracies about a cabal that's controlling the government and all these kind of things. And unfortunately, that weakens that social contract. It is essential. Without that social contract between people, between the different elements of the society, you know, you're going to have a social collapse. Now, in the Middle East, with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, add to it, especially, you know, during the, you know, not during, after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, I think we had a shift, even among these jihadis, where sectarianism became the geopolitical currency in the region. So you have groups like Saudi Arabia and Iran supporting these radicals on both sides in order to score geopolitical points against each other. And people in Iraq on both sides took it seriously. People in other places took it seriously. And now sectarianism continued to be a geopolitical currency. And then you have to fight terrorism, you know, but in the same time, you know, these groups that are terrorist groups, okay, we can allow them to function in Yemen. Well, we need them in Iraq so they can function in Iraq. Oh, well, we need them in Syria, so let's look the other way in Syria. We can't do that. And I think, unfortunately, this is where we are in the situation in the Middle East that we are today.
We're getting some great questions submitted by the audience. I'm going to try to mix the questions in with our conversation. One of the points that was raised by Brigitte Khouri from AUB, a psychiatrist, a professor, is how much does psychopathy and antisocial personalities account for men joining or leading these movements?
This is a very good question, and I think there is some studies in the United States about, at least not the white supremacists, but at least with the jihadis. And I think identity is an extremely important part of it. So I probably will say identity more, you know, I mean, and then, you know, people smarter than me can identify identity, and, you know, but there are so many people who just feel that they're alone. Nobody likes them. They are rejected in their own neighborhood or their society. And then you'll see people who basically make them feel important and tell them, hey, come and play soccer with us. Come to the mosque with us. By the way, all of us were going to Afghanistan. Do you want to come with us? You can go and have an adventure of your lifetime. And that is something that I'm not saying. That's something I heard from many people that I talked to throughout my career. And you've seen that also with many of the foreign fighters who came from Europe to join ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Many of them, like 80% of the people who joined from Belgium, for example, were in jail before. Right. And they thought about ISIS as a way to start with a clean slate with all their crimes and drugs and everything that they did before. And it was, you know, place where they felt that they are not second-class citizens. They are not being discriminated against. they are the rulers of the land. And we've seen that also with people who came from the UK. Same thing. So yes, I mean, there are a lot of studies into this, and this is definitely a significant component of the grievances that we talked about in that cycle.
Mhm. So one of the fascinating questions that I've looked at and talked to many people about as a journalist analyst um, is the question of how do we respond to these movements that threaten all of us in different parts of the world? And one of the big questions, of course, is do you zero in on the individuals and try to address activities, social support, talk to your local religious leaders, whatever, to help these kids not go into extreme movements, like which is very much the trend in Europe, I think, and some Arab countries? Or do you go and look at the macro level? Do you try to get governments to actually be more participatory, more accountable, let people lead a dignified life, make sure that everybody gets water, not just 2/3 of the population? And John Waterbury, a former president of AUB, who knows the Middle East better than most people in the Middle East, he sent the question asking, does the US handling of the Ku Klux Klan since its inception provide any lessons for how to handle domestic terrorism today? So it's these two angles. Do you focus on the groups individually, or do you try to focus on the macro picture and get a better society, which would not then generate these people?
I think, look, you know what? I think we have a lot of experiences from the past here in the United States to deal with this. I mean, like the question that you mentioned about the KKK. Yeah, you know, at one point, the KKK were a dominant force in American politics, even in Congress. I think in the early 1900s, you have the KKK parading in Washington, D.C. with thousands and thousands of members. But eventually, you know, throughout the years and the civil rights movements and all these things were pushed to the fringe, and it took decades to do so. So there are things that definitely we can do from learning from the past. Unfortunately, at this point, these guys are taking advantage of the hyper-partisan nature of our politics. And at one point in the United States, we had a mutual understanding of the truth. Today, I don't think we even have that mutual understanding of the truth. And I think we need to calm down the rhetoric. The politicians in Washington, they have to calm down the partisan rhetoric in order to move forward and tackle these issues. If we don't do that, a lot of the experience, we know what needs to be done, but it cannot be done because the moment you do it, it's going to fall through the partisan crack that exists in our society. Now, regarding your question, what was? Well, I'm sorry, Rami, still have jet lag. What was your question again?
A counterterrorism effort zero in on the individual?
Oh, on the individual, yeah. Look, you know what? We had a lot of different programs around the world, CVE programs, counter-violent extremism prevention programs. In order for the program to be effective, it's very resource intensive. It includes governments, it includes a community, psychologists, sociologists, family, religious leaders. And few governments in the world have the resources to do it right. And when it comes to the legal dimensions of it, you know, some countries in the West probably might have lots of legal constraints in creating off-ramps to deal with these individuals and these problems. But I mean, there are, you know, situations that we have different countries have different de-radicalization programs and counter-violent extremism programs that actually worked and is beneficial for individuals that is not really, you know, at phase 5 going to 6, going to terrorism in that cycle. But I think if you look into the reasons these problems are happening, they cannot be solved in a therapy session with a psychologist. if you look at the situation in Yemen, if you look at the situation in Syria, if you look at the situation in Iraq, if you look how groups, regional countries, and international powers are using non-state actors in order to promote their interests in these regions, these are the vacuums that are creating that violent environment where these groups can operate freely. This is what management of savagery, which the plan for Al-Qaeda is all about. Take advantage of these vacuums that exist in order to establish networks and so forth. You have both, Iran and its enemies using both violent extremist groups as basically an extension of their own power. We see it in Yemen, Iran using al-Houthi, Saudi Arabia directly and through other groups. We see it in Lebanon. We see it in Iraq. We've seen it in so many different places. And that vacuum that exists because of these groups fighting each other is creating an environment that it's very difficult for a psychiatrist to sit with an individual and say, hey, you know what, let's forget about these, issues that you believe in, and you have to kill the others because the others are bad and your enemy. For many of these people, they are so brainwashed that it's an existential battle in the good versus evil. Depends where they are, standing. So how can you try to do counter-violent extremism program in Lebanon? Where do you start? With whom do you start? Or try to do it in Syria, or try to do it in Iraq? The same thing in the United States. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try, and there's probably individuals that we can reach to. But again, if we don't agree on the truth, where do you start with this conversation? Do you start with them listening to Tucker Carlson on Fox or Rachel Maddow on MSNBC? I mean, because just take an hour, take a week listening to one of these programs, and you can be radical sometimes to one side or another. So I think it is, I think these programs are important, but they are important at a stage. First of all, we need to create a fertile ground to move forward. And then we can start to isolate these groups, like in the United States. Let's focus on the white supremacists. Let's focus on the people who are like on stage 4 or stage 5 on that cycle. And let's start to further isolate them to the fringe again. They have been always in the fringe. White supremacy was always in America. So let's push them to the fringe again, and let's isolate them from the wider mega movement, and let's isolate even mega movement from the wider Republican Party. And then start to have conversations about these kind of things and start to have a unified message regarding the national security of the United States and regarding the stability of our own government. And then we can move forward to deal with these people on the fringe, to figure out who can be prosecuted because of crimes they committed or who can be rehabilitated. But at this stage, to start a rehabilitation program, I think it's waste of effort and waste of money.
Yeah, I remember when 9/11 happened, I was here, I was a fellow at Harvard. And I remember distinctly when it happened, the next day, there were special tables in the bookshops about Islam. Everybody said, oh my gosh, we got to learn about Islam. And for the next year or two, they were talking about, well, you got to deal with those madrasas. Don't let them do all these, take these kids to the madrasas. So that at the beginning, there was this intense American focus in society, and I think probably in the government as well, but you would know better. But there was this amazing, intense focus on religion. What you're describing now, of course, with your knowledge, is a way more complex and sophisticated and multidimensional situation where human beings and their societies and their psyches and their politics and their economic conditions all mixed together with foreign invasions and whatever. Do you feel that the understanding in, say, the Western countries of the violence that happens, whether in the Middle East or here, is now at a more sophisticated stage? do people in authority understand better how these things happen and therefore what we can do about them?
I think I'll try to be very honest and blunt with this. No, I think people in government, people in the intelligence community and law enforcement community probably have a very good understanding. Academics and researchers who look into this, definitely they have a very good understanding. But God forbid there's a terrorist attack tomorrow. The media, politicians, they will go to cover this as and to talk about it with such very skin deep understanding of the problem. They simplify it. Media is not interested in explaining and educating to the people, as we know. We don't have that journalism anymore. Very rare. We have it, but very rare in the US. We have media entities that only care about ratings and making money. And educating is not, does not bring great ratings. Shouting and screaming bring great ratings. So unfortunately, I think if, God forbid, anything happened, they will go back to talk about it in very very silly way. And that's why you don't see them covering the white supremacy in the United States, because they are forced to actually go deep in understanding all these kind of things, and they don't want to. Look at how they covered Charlottesville and the president's reaction to it, or Proud Boys, stand down and stand by, and the president's reaction to it. It was all about Trump. They never talked about this political movement or this socioeconomic movement that's happening in America. They didn't want to discuss that, or the attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh, or the attack on the Walmart in Texas. They never went deep in understanding all these kind of things. And when the insurrection happens, like, oh, we can't believe this is happening. Really? You can't believe it? You can't see it happening throughout the last 40 years with the narrative of the president that gave them a total cover for, they felt emboldened. Now, I don't believe Trump is a racist. And a lot of people on the left go crazy on me when I say that. Part of me would love to have Trump as a racist. That means he believes something other than himself. I think Trump only believes in himself. And he thinks these groups can be manipulated and used in his political quest, and he's using them. And they are using him as well. From what we see and what they talk about, they really don't like him nor like his supporters. It's actually he's useful for them, and that's what they say. He's very useful, but he's not a leader.
Right. One of the dimensions of the movements in the United States now that is being written about a little bit in some of the more serious media are the links to Christian evangelical groups, and of course this raises the question of the religious dimension here among some of these groups. Possibly it's not 100% clear. What is your sense of that? Does Christian evangelical nationalism play a role in any of these groups?
Yeah, absolutely, and there is a lot of evidence to that. And again, I don't want to say that all of them are like this, but definitely it plays role, and it plays very similar role to some of the Islamic establishment that they played in the development of radical extremist Islamic groups.
One of the things that's also striking and frightening is that in both the Western world and the Middle East Asia region, these groups seem to continue to expand, despite all of the military force, economic, social, religious, psychological efforts that people have tried to deal with them. They continue to expand, and ISIS is now doing more attacks in northern Syria and northern Iraq, and growing in parts of the Western Africa and the Horn of Africa. So, and of course in the US, these groups seem to be growing. So what is your sense, if you take a big view of both the reasons that these groups emerge, and they're slightly different but very similar, as you explained, in both parts of the world. What is your sense about what do we need to do as societies, whether it's government or media or whatever, what do we need to do besides what we're doing now, which doesn't seem to be very effective? The security military dominant response doesn't seem to work very well.
Well, I think the incubating factors that gave the conditions for these groups to exist in the first place continue to exist. So why do you think this is going to change if everything is still the same? So you have to try to effect a change. Give an example, Yemen, for example. Al-Qaeda in Yemen before the Arab Coalition War were probably about 700 to 800 people. Now Al-Qaeda is about 8,000 people in Yemen. Now, I'm not saying that those 8,000 people are really adhering to bin Laden's views of the world and they believe in his jihad and his fatwas. But many of them are there because they want protection. They want social services that only Al-Qaeda can give them. They want, schools for their children that Al-Qaeda is opening for them. They want healthy clinics that the government or, because of the conditions in Yemen are not doing. And many of them are, in areas and regions who are Sunnis and scared of the Houthis coming over. I mean, this is as simple as that. So if you end the war in Yemen, right, Al-Qaeda in Yemen will probably go back to be a couple of hundreds eventually. I prefer to be dealing with a couple of hundreds than a couple of thousands, right? But as long as that war is raging, then I think it's kind of like trying to put down a huge fire in a huge building with a small little kitchen towel, right? It's not going to work. We're kidding ourselves. The same thing in As-Sahel. The condition that allowed Al-Qaeda in As-Sahel to become multi-ethnic group, before it was mostly Algerian, remnant of the Algerian war. Now you have Tuareg, you have Fulanis, you have Arabs, all these different factions unified under Al-Qaeda's banner in As-Sahel, and AQIM now is considered probably strategically in As-Sahel region a bigger threat than ISIS.
To explain is Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb.
Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. So then you have the issue in Chad, and then you had the French coming over, and before that you had the Libyan civil war with all the weapons that came from Libya. So there's so many different conditions that led to where Al-Qaeda is today in the Islamic Maghreb or in a Sahel region. But you know what? If you don't deal with these cultural conditions and social conditions and tribal conditions in the region, again, you'll be having this small little kitchen towel trying to put down the fire. Even in Chad, with different tribes, you have the herders and you have the farmers. And the farmers go and kill the herders, and the herders, they go because they're fighting on resources and water. So Al-Qaeda comes and support the herders against the farmers and so forth. And the violence continue. If you go to Iraq, without basically a real social contract, for the Iraqis, by the Iraqis, not the one that was installed by the United States and M. Bremer after 2003 invasion by Bremer, basically that took the very successful Lebanese model and implemented it in Iraq. The Shia, the Sunnis, the Kurds, everybody has like a position in the government, everybody has a quota in the parliament. The Sunnis gonna always feel that they are being targeted by the Shia and the Iranians. Gulf states gonna support them because they wanted to make Iran's life miserable, and Iran is going to use Iraq as a cornerstone in its policy in the region. And as long as we have these kind of issues, and Iraq is, as you mentioned earlier, weak state, cannot control all these different factions, that some of them are stronger than the government itself, we're not going to have all these things to stop. So let's look at the conditions that allowed these groups to happen. we cannot ignore the condition and just focus on the symptom, right? We have to focus on the reason of that cancer, not the symptoms of that cancer. If you deal with the symptoms, you can keep treating the symptoms from now until hell freezes over, but the cancer is still there.
Yeah. We have another question from Suzanne Enzerink, who's a visiting professor at AUB in the Center for American Studies and Research, which is co-hosting this event. She's asking about, from the media, there's a lot of talk about governmental agencies, including security ones like the FBI and Justice, being politicized under Trump. And we saw, this is my comment here, adding to that, the Capitol insurrection starting to show, reporting is starting to show some links between some people in the Capitol, some people outside. And the question she has, is there a mechanism now to address in the United States the fear that some of these agencies are becoming politicized or compromised as federal agencies?
Honestly, I don't see, like, for example, security agencies like the FBI and the CIA. I think Trump tried to politicize them, but I think it did not work. It was obvious it did not work. They continued. How many DNI resigned because they refused to, play ball with Trump on many issues. The FBI. The FBI director went to Congress a few times and said the number one threat to the United States is white supremacy and domestic terrorism groups. They are on par with the jihadis, even more dangerous than the jihadis. This is something the Trump administration, frankly, did not want to hear. Now, there are reports, as mentioned in the questions, of people in Congress who potentially were connected to people who were involved in the insurrection. And this is being investigated. We don't know how accurate this is, but I won't be surprised because you have members of the House who basically repeat the rhetoric of those individuals who were involved in the insurrection, and they continue to do so until today. So I won't be surprised. Some of them actually spoke very passionately and quote unquote radicalizing these groups before they went up to on Pennsylvania Avenue to attack the Capitol. So that is a big possibility. Now, the third element of this question is, yes, we have people from law enforcement entities, local police, who were involved in the insurrection. And that's something that we have been warning about. In our center, we warned about for a while. And also we wrote some intel briefs about this. And after we start, ringing the bell on this issue, the FBI put a statement on white supremacist organizations penetrating law enforcement in the United States, state and local police, especially local police. And also members of the military who adhere to these ideologies of white supremacists and other radical ideologies. And the Pentagon basically had to do security check for the 25,000 people who were involved in securing the Capitol because of that. So this probably, I hope it's now, put the government in a position that they have to act. They have to act about the problem with white supremacy and neo-Nazi influence or existence, not influence, in the ranks of the military. And the military can do a lot in cleansing that influence immediately because it's the military. They don't have to adhere to all the union issues that probably local police might have. And I think in local police, I think what we are seeing now, that at least people who were involved in the insurrection, either they were fired or they are being investigated while they put on leave. But yeah, I mean, this is a very important question and we have to look at it. And so far, I think our institutions endures. But frankly, if we don't do anything about it, if we don't deal with all the issues that we have been talking about in a bipartisan manner, I don't know if we can endure for 8 years from now or 10 years from now. But so far, I think we're enduring.
We've only got about 5 minutes left. I want to ask a couple of quick questions. Give me some quick answers so we can
Sure.
Fascinating question from Tammy Palacios, asking about what are your thoughts about imprisoning those who've been accused after a fair trial if they're found guilty, putting them in prison, given that in the Middle East and Asia, prison was the place where a lot of these movements were born. It was an incubating place where these guys got together and they came out of prison and then so is prison a reasonable solution in the short run to deal with this problem?
That's a very good question. And I think I separate between federal prison and state prisons. I think we have a lot of protocols in federal prisons that separate these individuals from each other. We don't have the issues with the gangs and stuff like that and the white supremacy and all the things that you see in federal prisons. And in our federal prisons, we have every person who was involved in a big terrorist attack, from the World Trade Center to the East Africa embassy bombings to the USS. A lot of them are there and they are been done, Ramzi Youssef, securely. But I think that's definitely something that they need to definitely pay very close attention to.
Arlene Germain has a great question. How do you account for the rising number of women willing to employ violence as seen in the January 6th insurrection? And of course, we've seen women play a major role in the jihadi movements in various ways and in the Islamic State. And just to be fair to the Middle East region, women have been leading many of the democratic uprisings, peaceful democratic uprisings as well. So the role of women in these various things, what's your comment on that from your knowledge?
I don't know. I mean, it's just, again, we've seen it here, we've seen it in the Middle East. And I think, women are taking their rightful place in a lot of movements around the world. Some movements are good, some movements are bad.
Yeah. So like all human beings, people can be good, they can be bad.
Yep. Yeah.
Ahmed Fawzi, who's had a distinguished career at the UN, has a two-part question, which I'll put into one part, which is, are intelligence agencies, to your knowledge, working closely together in an effective way around the world? And does the UN have a role to play in this process?
That's a very good question. It depends on what target. If we're talking about the white supremacy, it is very difficult. I think the UN started to look into this. There is a report by CTED in the UN, the Counterterrorism Directorate, talked about the rise of white supremacy. They don't call it white supremacy, they call it ethnically motivated, whatever, huge name for it to go around the term white supremacy. So yes, they start to look into the threat, and the UN played very good role in also countering the jihadis. There is a report that they do annually about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They just issued the report actually a couple of weeks ago. The UN is a place where a lot of the countries, they sit together and they meet. But as you know, he works in the UN. I think you know that sometimes it's the bureaucracy of the UN is really hard to do effective, meaningful, and swift policies. As for the white supremacists, I think, as for the intelligence agencies working for each other, yeah, I mean, if it's the jihadis, absolutely. They are very, very closely working together around the world, especially the Five Eyes countries. But when it comes to white supremacists, the situation is different. From the United States, for example, as long as these groups are not designated as terrorist organizations, as long as the leadership of the white supremacist movements come from the United States and also from American citizens, I think the CIA and the NSA's hands are tight in doing much to monitor them because there is no legal ground for these monitoring. So I think the situation is a little bit difficult, and that's why we're trying to basically focus on the transnational nature of that threat and connect it to international terrorism. So many of the tools that's available against international terrorism can be used against this threat. So yes, unfortunately, there are a lot of legal constraints that prevent intelligence cooperation in the West in targeting the white supremacy threat.
And we'll end with a comment from a listener, and then your final closing comments from Maya Bloom, who's a leading scholar of these issues of radicalization. And among her credentials is she taught my son at Cornell many years ago, but that's personal stuff. And Maya says, you should never be surprised by radicalized women. And when you get the woman, quote, you guarantee that the children will follow in their father's footsteps. What's your perception of that?
No, absolutely. I mean, Maya have been phenomenal in studying women and children in ISIS, and now she's looking into the radicalized, white supremacists. So she's an authority on this, and she has a lot of studies done, and she continued to be a pioneer in that field. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with her.
Mm-hmm. So if we know so much, if you and scholars and others know so much about these people and these movements and these forces, why are they continuing to grow? My last question.
The incompetency of governments.
And with that, Ali Soufan, we thank you very much for being with us. Great session. We've learned a lot, and there's many dimensions that still need to be explored. We look forward to keeping in touch and collaborating with you. I need to thank Alison Freeland and her group in New York and Beirut, especially Justin Tessier, who handled all the tech stuff, and then Joseph and Dennis and Eric and others, and all of the staff at the Soufan Center. Thank you all. It's been a wonderful experience, and this problem is going to be with us, so we will be back one day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you, everyone.